converge are becoming main coordination centers, the synchroners of which there are thousands in the solar system. The level of a synchroner is determined by the number of corporations that own megacities on its territory and can be changed. The center of human civilization is the synchroner, where the 5 major corporations of the solar system merge into a single megacity, SynthCorp. The lifting of the ban on changing the human genome led to the disappearance of most life-threatening diseases and extended human life. The increase in brain size made natural birth impossible. The fusion of genetic material and human prenatal development occur entirely in external conditions. Nevertheless, artificial changes to the genome have led to a number of new problems, one of the main ones. People have lost the ability to freely exchange genetic material inside their species. In addition to the disappearance of concepts of nationality and citizenship, now replaced by corporate affiliation, the concepts of sex and gender have lost their former social and biological meanings, and differences in these characteristics have become no more significant than differences in the color of eyes, skin, or hair. The concept of strain came into use. Members of the same strain, regardless of their biological sex at birth, can combine their DNA and have common offspring. The DNA of different strains is in most cases incompatible. According to the law on the unification of humanity, all corporations are required to strive for a uniform number of different strains in the population, both within the corporation and at its different sublevels. Union between different strains is highly socially encouraged, since there is still a chance that their DNA can combine. A transplanetary policy of equivalence of strains is being pursued, aimed at reuniting humanity into one species. However, new strains appear every few decades. The physical and mental differences between the 9 main strains are becoming increasingly obvious, and the likelihood that different strains will be able to produce offspring is becoming increasingly less likely. Human civilization is at the stage of formation of new species, some of which show a tendency towards hierarchical primacy. Humanity tries to restrain the division of their species and hierarchical stratification based on strains, since they are unable to predict what the supernova of humanity will turn into, the stars of new species, or into a black hole that will consume itself. Due to the complex system of corporations' location, wars in the usual sense became impossible, and intraspecific aggression found another manifestation. Corporations are in a state of constant economic growth, interaction, and confrontation, the most acute phase of which is manifested in espionage, the elimination of competitors, often former partners, and in targeted clashes of small groups of corporate mercenaries, envoys. Despite the fact that such things happen in the shadows, they often determine the birth, change, or disintegration of the synchroners. 5 central corporations that make up SynthCorp and 12 smaller ones are in a state of unstable equilibrium, just like humanity as a species. This is the world in which this story begins. Chapter 1. Miro. On this day, like yesterday, and the day before yesterday, and many days before that, Miro woke up to the voice of the news program host. Following the sound, whose volume gradually increased, colors appeared before her eyes. At first dull, then increasingly bright and clear. Initially indistinguishable blotches gradually started to resemble human silhouettes. The alarm went off exactly at 6 in the morning. First came on. After 2 minutes, the sound became louder. After another 2 minutes, colors began to appear. Exactly at 0607, both the visual and audio plugins were fully operational. Miro almost immediately turned off all the alarm plugins, which only required her to shift her gaze to the red symbol in the lower left corner of her field of view. Today's broadcast was not the most suitable for starting a work shift. In complete silence, she began to dress leisurely, but her imagination, without the involvement of the neural interface, began to recall the intrusive voice of the host and the unpleasant visual symbols that voice had commented on. It wasn't uncommon anymore, though, and she should be used to it by now. The news always spoke in general terms. Victim on level 3. Traces of brief resistance. Investigators are establishing the possibility of a sexual motive. The victim and the perpetrator could have belonged to different strains. But even this was enough for Miro's imagination to start attacking her with the most vivid and frightening images. It was such a pity that the autonomous activity of the nervous system couldn't be turned off like sensory interfaces. There were still no buttons in the subconscious, and the subconscious was ruthless to her. A terrifying figure approached closer. Pale bluish skin, thin and long spider-like arms, a sharp stone-carved predatory face. One hand gripped her throat, and Miro felt that soul-chilling, paralyzing fear. The brain already knew what would happen next, and before death, it would do you one last favor. It would seem as if none of this was real, as if it was all a horrible dream, and you would wake up soon. But you wouldn't wake up. The quiescent strain had already diverged so much from the others that sexual intercourse with a quiescent without dimorphization was impossible. To be precise, one of the partners simply wouldn't survive. Many quiescents who weren't born under one of the central quint's crests had at best only heard of such a procedure, especially if they came from megacity of corporation whose synchroners are in unstable stages. Rumors circulated that quiescents from unstable regions, especially if they attacked the experientia strain, would tear pieces of flesh from the victims while they were still alive. In a way, this could even be called merciful blood loss, hastened death. Of course, quiescents weren't a strain of criminals and rapists, and those born under the crests of the central quint could be found on any level. Crimes occurred at all levels, committed by anyone and against anyone. Mentioning a person's strain in that context was unacceptable. It didn't break the unity and genetic diversity law, but it was considered extremely bad form and could significantly harm career prospects and consequently socialization in general. And yet, every time Miro heard news like this, it was as if she felt what had really happened. Miro knew it was very wrong to think that way. From childhood, she had been taught that every strain was equal to another, and the strength of humanity lays in diversity and mutual complementarity. Humans were a species that had mastered several planets of their native star, and were ready to venture to new stars. All people were equal regardless of the corporation crest, level of wealth, religion, or strain. The genome of each person was inherently equal to the genome of another, as they all constituted a single whole, a continuous chain of information that must and would spread beyond their native planet, beyond their native star, to new galaxies. This was what they were taught in kindergarten. This was what they were taught in school. This was what everyone solemnly and publicly vowed to when they first received the right to wear their corporation's crest upon reaching adulthood. Miro was ashamed of her fear, ashamed of her horrible thoughts that placed one strain below another, deeming some lives unimportant and dangerous, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. Miro knew for sure that the attacker was a young quiescent male who had recently arrived from the territory of one of the unstable corporations. His megacity had undergone cross-versioning or had been entirely relocated. He had never once donned a corporation crest. Most likely, he came from a family with a low level of education and was highly religious. Such individuals had many prejudices and considered genital dimorphization something indecent. Miro often saw quiescents of such type gathering in large groups, 20, 30, sometimes even more. Just on the street, they would embrace each other by the shoulders, touch foreheads, and then sing in a loud, drawn-out manner. Many found this melody beautiful, but the low throat singing and the smooth, synchronous movements of such a large group of people performing a strange and incomprehensible ritual caused Miro's heart to race. And Miro knew for certain that the person mentioned in the news was one of them. Before transitioning to the new corporation, the young man had been surrounded predominantly by members of his own strain. The megacities of unstable corporations often couldn't achieve the necessary strain diversity. In the megacity of Centaurium, he had almost for the first time encountered people who differed from him much more than anyone he had met before. And when he first saw a woman of the experientia strain, it took his breath away as if he had been punched in the stomach. In a way, she was just as much a woman as quiescent women, but, as it seemed to him, with exaggerated feminine features. Her skin was light brown and appeared so soft that it incited a desire to touch it. Her unnaturally large brown eyes with long black eyelashes, despite covering almost their entire bodies with clothing, compared to the women of his strain, Experientia's breasts, waist, and hips all seemed exaggeratedly large and as if sculpted from delicate, airy dough. But the strongest sensation was the smell. It seemed so intense that the quiescent ceased to see and hear, drowning in a sea of this scent. And thus, being engulfed by a whirlpool of such strong emotions, Quiescent could not believe that before him was a living being with the same feelings and emotions as his own, that it was also a human, capable of feeling joy and pain. They seemed like artificially created dolls, made for pleasure. Miro looked like one of those dolls, and for some reason she knew for sure that these were precisely the thoughts in the minds of the quiescents who met her gaze. And Miro was ashamed of such her thoughts. Guide to Neurobiology, Psychopharmacology, and Pathoneurology for 8 to 11 semesters. Rank 2. Level M3F approved by the High Council for Junior and Mid-Level Scientific Personnel Training. Specialization. Cross-strain DNA crossing. Clearance Level 18. Megacity 7. Centaurium Corporation. Year 280. The basis for classifying modern homostrains are hyperbolized DNA alleles. It is hypothesized, word highlighted, that the cause of these segments' emergence was the removal of recessive, above the word recessive added, weak, gene alleles while retaining the dominant, above the word dominant added, strong alleles. The complication in zygote formation, above the word zygote added, first stage of the embryo, of repaired DNA added, DNA of humans who underwent purification from problematic and junk genes. By the end of the 22nd century, these constituted 80% of Earth's population, led to the predominance in the population of individuals whose parents' DNA matched in both, presence of dominant alleles and the absence of corresponding recessive ones. The period of phenotypic semi-expression added time needed for the twofold enhancement of the ability encoded by the gene for most hyperbolized alleles is 2 to 3 generations. The time from the first merging of mutually enhancing DNA to the appearance of offspring, with the first manifestation of the phenotype determining the homostrain, added a specific strain abilities for most hyperbolized alleles is equal to the period of semi-expression. The foundations and principles of the physiological characteristics of homostrains of the second tertia. Quiescent, quiescentit modus. Members of this strain possess the ability, with varying degrees of accuracy, to determine the emotional background of one or a group of people and the dynamic changes of this background. Transvision. Some members of the strain can develop this skill to such an extent, in certain contexts, they can determine the probable actions and action chains of a selected person at a distance of up to 70 meters, though the actual distance may be greater. The presumed physiology of the skill suggests that the strain has heightened olfactory sensitivity to certain components of human secretions, particularly to metabolites of hormones, neurotransmitters, and other biologically active substances that may be present in sweat and other secretions. The exact list of substances to which quiescents may be sensitive is unknown, but it reliably includes the metabolic products of the dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine systems. There have been isolated cases where members of the quiescent strain were able to recount the abstract thought processes of another person. Currently, there is insufficient data to reliably confirm or refute such abilities. The earliest manifestation of transvision is possible during the period of sexual maturity, 25 years for the quiescent strain. Social restrictions. According to the Centaurium's legal framework, from the age of 22, all members of the strain are required to undergo conscious reduction training in the frontal cortical areas of the brain that control transvision. The inability to control, added word, deactivate, transvision at the onset of sexual maturity can affect the mental health of the strain member. Such episodes are observed among quiescent members arriving in Centaurium from unstable regions of the solar system. Regardless of age, all members of the quiescent strain arriving in Centaurium from other corporations' megacities must undergo mandatory testing for the ability to control transvision and subsequent training if necessary. This rule does not apply to citizens of the CQ, Central Quint, corporations. Specialized training in conscious control over transvision is not mandatory and is determined by corporate status. Experientia, Experientia creatoris. Members of this strain can enhance or weaken the emotional responses of an individual or group of people within a distance of up to 30 meters. Heteroprojection. This ability can be applied to positive and neutral effects. Cases of enhancing negative effects have not been. There have been isolated cases where members of the Experientia strain encouraged specific actions in the influence object. Confirmation or refutation of such abilities is impossible due to insufficient data. Physiological basis. Poorly studied. It is presumed that the physiological basis is linked to the ability of Experientia strain members to release substances into their bloodstream that are chemically similar to certain hormones and neurotransmitters, but have no effect on the strain member themselves. The mechanism of selective influence on a specific person in a group is unknown. The age of skill manifestation coincides with the onset of sexual maturity and is 32 years. Social restrictions. From the age of 29, all members of the Experientia strain must undergo mandatory training to reduce the activity of the frontal lobe areas of the brain associated with heteroprojection. All strain members arriving in Centaurea megacities from other regions must undergo a test for the ability to consciously control heteroprojection, with subsequent training if necessary. This rule does not apply to citizens of the Central Quint corporations. Intendit, que intendit bene, one of the more recent Homo strains and the youngest of the second Tertia strains. Approximate manifestation date, the late 23rd century. It is recently hypothesized that the strain is much older as its abilities manifest only as a result of interaction with the localizer. Unlike other strains, the defining qualities of intendit at an age. Miro didn't find out at what age intendit skills could manifest, because the accidental synchronization was interrupted. The student sitting opposite had left the transporter, and the girl immediately lost interest, which had suddenly arisen when her not-too-expensive sensor accidentally picked up information from an even cheaper student storage device. Although even if she had read to the end, it probably wouldn't have stayed in her mind, and she wouldn't have understood what she had read. No, theory wasn't her thing, but she was good at practice. Miro loved her job. Young woman looked through the transparent floor of the transport module and 3 large domes of the University of Natural Sciences and Bioengineering, the largest in Megacity 7. The domes symbolize Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, the 3 planets colonized by humans. Miro, look of the university, mostly because it reminded her of 3 scoops of ice cream. 3 huge scoops, shimmering with holographic images in a tall bowl on several wide columns, at the base of which, like a waterfall of cubes, flowed numerous chains of DNA. Half a block walking after exiting the module, and Miro ran her hand over the holoshield of a large door twice her height. It slowly and silently opened. There was always a very unnatural and interesting feeling due to the mismatch of one action to another. A barely noticeable finger movement shifted the massive door, made of material imitating wood, which looked more like the gates of an ancient fortress than the entrance to the Center for Psychocognitive Support, Control, and Correction. Upon entering, Miro launched the workgroup greeting script. In response, Visual Plugin reflected a dozen images with greeting symbols from her sector colleagues. At her locker, she put on soft, less attractive but more practical, compared to her high heels, shoes, and swapped her personal localizer for the corporate one. The synchronization on the latter was slightly higher, 39%, compared to 31% on her own. In any case, the threshold level for her position was 25%, which was quite high in average. As usual, Miro exchanged a friendly glance with Ray. Ray, sitting at the desk opposite, put a bit more into her smile than just a colleague's greeting, but Miro either didn't notice or chose not to notice how often Ray looked at her with her large and unusually green, as for an Experientia, eyes. Of course, Ray couldn't have imagined that someone might use heteroprojection on her in such a place. Besides being the obvious fact that it was unethical, sensors strictly monitored any brain activity patterns related to the use of strain-specific abilities in prohibited areas. Ray was indeed surprised when, upon first seeing Miro 2 years ago, her copulation cycle unexpectedly and earlier than it should shifted towards a partner with a female hormone pheromone profile. She chalked it up to stress. A couple of times over coffee, Ray would casually talk about genital dimorphizations she had undergone as if she was talking about new manicure. Among all strains, Experientia usually began dimorphization procedures the earliest. Naturally, this was largely a matter of financial standing, but those who could afford it usually aimed to try out all the basic genital patterns within the first year of reaching the required age. Ray wasn't among those privileged, but she still underwent the procedure every few years, mostly when there was a release of the new Cygene variations. Ray preferred their products over those from her native Centaurium. Although Cygene wasn't part of the CQ, using Cygene bioengineers' services was considered a mark of good taste among the informed. Unfortunately for Ray, Miro apparently didn't know this. Ray often tried to subtly find out what genital pattern Miro currently had, but Miro would always listen with interest, sometimes even asking questions, which especially encouraged Ray, but never shared anything about herself. Thus, she didn't know even that much. By external signs and evidently by birth, Miro was a woman and had a female hormone pheromone profile. Ray herself was also a woman by birth and had recently updated her masculine genital pattern to a bimasculine one. She always only underwent genital dimorphizations and never full masculinization or quasi-masculinization. Today, as always, Miro responded to Ray's greeting with a brief smile and nod before, almost immediately, turning her attention to the work holoshield. Her shift began at 9, and the first 5 requests were already waiting for review. Overall, the day proceeded quite typically for her. The synchronization level never dropped below 33%. The tasks were manageable: 3 suicide attempts, 2 dying patients, 2 relatives of the dying, 5 episodes of adolescent depression, all recurrences, 3 divorce cases, 7 cases of professional burnout. In all cases, the main problem was a drop in the effective synchronization of the localizer by 15–20% from the maximum possible. Only one task seemed interesting to Miro. At first glance, it was just another overworked engineer, but she timely noted the range from which the subject's synchronization levels had dropped, from 64 to 62%. Moreover, the task was marked as high priority. The first thing that should have caught her attention was the subject's extremely high initial level. Generally, the requests Miro handled involved subjects with synchronization levels of around 40–50% at most. These were usually various types of engineers, from genital plugin developers to housing module planners, mid-level managers, and many others whose work required synchronization levels around 20–30%, including Miro herself. It could be that someone from the support sector where Miro worked was responsible for her localizers. Optimal synchronization. Most of the time, Miro corrected minor errors and referred cases requiring serious intervention to narrow specialists. But over 60%, this was a first for her. Even more concerning was that the system identified the drop as critical. For Miro, a 2% drop was less than the margin of error. Her personal localizer's accuracy was ±3%, and 1.5% for corporate. In any case, Miro followed the protocol strictly. She determined whether this was a result of a system error. There was no error, and a repeated scan showed the same level of decline. Fluctuations in the activity of basic vital centers both at the cortex and subcortex levels showed no traces of chemical or radiation exposure. There were also no traces of illegal programs and devices usage. Miro performed the same procedure as recommended in such cases at 10 different time segments defined by the system. Everything was clean. Even too clean, even and stable. The subject she was reviewing resembled an expensively built and flawlessly operating mechanism whose efficiency had slightly decreased. In any case, everything was done correctly, and if the system deemed this decrease as critical, she had no choice but to report the work done and forward the task to medical expertise. Miro didn't have the clearance to correct subjects with initial synchronization above 50%. In this case, her task was reduced to a simple sorter, but she performed such tasks well. Of course, she was curious about who it might be, perhaps someone close to one of the central councils, or even a council member, or maybe an Whoever it was, Miro will never find out. In this task, almost all information, including the type of activity, was anonymized, and randomization of subjects were of paramount importance in the Center for Psychocognitive Support, Control, and Correction. Nevertheless, even without this knowledge, Miro liked knowing that she was helping people, which meant they would better perform their corporate tasks, and therefore her native Centaurium, one of the 5 corporations of the CQ, would function and successfully compete. On her way home, the 3 ice cream balls of the university, over which the transport module passed, significantly lost their ability to attract the eye in the evening twilight, compared to the aesthetic, and especially to advertising holograms that had come to life. As for the latter, it can be said that marketing designers faced a serious challenge. It wasn't enough to create a memorable color combination and an interesting slogan. To attract and be remembered, at least in the moment, an advertising hologram had to compete with such 22nd century artists as Alan Doublier and Enya Neo, not to mention Daniel Pereira. At least as long as municipal authorities paid for the aesthetic holograms of high level. It's not hard to guess that corporations could use this to their advantage. Perhaps the most famous case was 5 years ago, when a promotional campaign for the new recreational localizer model from Universe United coincided with launch of high-level aesthetic holo, Conquering Jupiter by Fedash Korsakov. Municipal aesthetic centers of most of Centaurium's megalopolises done this, including Megacity 7. Residents were surprised, to say the least, that the authorities decided to museum hologram of such status to decorate the megalopolises during a period with no significant dates, except for the release of the latest localizer model from Universe United at that time. HQ corporations had quotas obligating them to give each other the opportunity to conduct advertising campaigns for other corporations in their megalopolises, but no one from outside could regulate what specific aesthetic holograms a corporation could use in its megacities, and for how long. For several months, residents of almost all levels of Megacity 7 observed panoramic scenes of how the first atmosphere generators descended from the sky onto the surface of the gas giant. How thousands of brave colonizers, sacrificing themselves, managed construction drones in deadly conditions. Because 100 years ago, a construction drone operator couldn't control the construction process from the Earth or any other space station by pressing buttons, but had to be directly at the operations site. Of course, most interest was attracted by scenes, where thousands of transport and escort ships from the 5 corporations, which would later form the CQ, were scattering across already developed parts of the solar system with the first containers of Centaurium. It is said that sales of the new Universe United localizer model that year were 7% lower than the previous model's launch year. But the aesthetic holograms of this evening were nothing special, and Miro's gaze fell on a massive blue canvas stretching across the block. It depicted a blue, cloudless, transparent sky, merging with the deep blue sea, and a distant ancient sailing ship appeared. The ship was from the times when people had not yet explored every corner of their own planet. The sails on its 3 tall masts were golden, and the ship itself looked as if it also was made of gold. As the ship appeared on the horizon and drew closer, its outline began to resemble a predatory bird swooping down on its prey. Following the logo, the name Aburana Magna Corporation appeared at the bottom. The hologram showed a first-person view, and the viewer flew through the levels of the megapolis. The city changed rapidly as if in time-lapse photography. In mere seconds, new skyscrapers appeared, bridges were built, and entire levels expanded. It felt as if you were not just flying through space, but also moving at great speed through time. At certain moments, the camera would stop and focus on brief episodes of random people life, though it was clear that the advertisement targeted middle-class consumers. Miro liked the video sequence and connected to it directly. The background music had simple ethnic motifs, setting a calm tone, more to soothe than to motivate any active action, which was very fitting for the evening time. First, the camera paused on a group of people who seemed to be gathering for a fun evening. They laughed, each wearing a thin strip of a disc localizer. This season, many corporations were producing minimalist-style products. Next, a group of students in a university library, each with the same disc. Then, happy families. another fly-through of several levels, and on an open terrace of an office building, presumably on the 5th level, stood a group of people in formal suits with localizers of the same shape. The music quieted, and a male and female voice alternated speaking. A multifunctional localizer for all ages and types of brain activity. For leisure and work. High synchronization rate and increased precision in targeting the necessary brain areas. Scenes of everyday life faded into the background and blurred slightly, while a semi-transparent image of a human brain with a new model of the localizer appeared in the foreground. Barely noticeable light indicators on the device changed color to the music and synchronized with them. 3-dimensional neural networks of different colors lit up inside the brain, intertwined with each other. Localizer BM12J by Burana Magna Corp. We use the most precise maps of functional activity and new technology for synchronous activation of mutually reinforcing cerebral networks. You get the maximum efficiency from your brain, regardless of what you're doing. Our unique feature, reducing the activity of antagonist networks, allows you to gain additional efficiency without power consumption. Then the camera flew into the brain and began moving even faster between the glowing nerve cell extensions of various colors. Where cells connected, a bright silver light shone. The flight speed kept increasing, and at some point, almost imperceptibly to the viewers, they found themselves not inside the brain, but within an interplanetary corporate network, connected by endless streams of transport modules and ships of various purposes. The product is certified for use in any point of the solar system. For a while longer, the music played, and the advertisement took the viewer at high speed through corporate megacities in various parts of colonized space. As the music almost faded, the image, blurring, began to vaguely resemble the outlines of nude bodies in dark blue tones. During smooth movements of the curves, simultaneously reminiscent of silhouettes of numerous human bodies of varying degrees of masculinity and femininity, a voice almost whispered. BM12J by Burana Magna has a special synchronization mode with peripheral neural tissues, which we use for intimate demorphization purposes. She continued watching commercial after leaving the municipal transport. Perhaps it was because the images of happy families were some of the most frequent scenes in the commercial. Miro had no memory of her own family and did not feel any negative emotions about it. On the contrary, she found it interesting to observe groups of people united by genetic ties and attributing special, almost sacred significance to it. It seemed unnatural to her, but she understood that, from the majority's point of view, something was wrong with her. The commercial was ending when Miro, without finishing watching, interrupted the synchronization due to a strange feeling of being watched. In fact, it seemed that she had been waiting for this moment, whatever the reason. This time, Miro took a new route. Something urged her to walk, and she followed this unusual desire without doubts. She turned a bit earlier than usual to bypass her block from the other side, but due to renovation work in that area, she had to walk further than initially planned. At certain point, residential buildings gave way to rows of blocks of vertical pipes, probably intended for Centaurium transport. The tubes rose from the ground, resembling closely planted tree trunks, and twisted more as they approached the transition to the next level. The visual plug-in of her neurosensor highlighted a warning about a high level of antisocial activity in the current location. Following the warning were audio and visual recommendations urging her to leave the area. Route. Prologue, the year 2317. Human species has spread to 4 planets of the solar system and many interplanetary stations. Corporations have come to replace nation-states. Each is represented by a Ross planetary network of megacities. The places where multiple megacities, belonging to different corporations, converge are becoming main coordination centers, the synchroners of which there are thousands in the solar system. The level of a synchroner is determined by the number of corporations that own megacities on its territory and can be changed. The center of human civilization is the synchroner, where the 5 major corporations of the solar system merge into a single megacity, SynthCorp. The lifting of the ban on changing the human genome led to the disappearance of most life-threatening diseases and extended human life. The increase in brain size made natural birth impossible. The fusion of genetic material and human prenatal development occur entirely in external conditions. Nevertheless, artificial changes to the genome have led to a number of new problems, one of the main ones. People have lost the ability to freely exchange genetic material inside their species. In addition to the disappearance of concepts of nationality and citizenship, now replaced by corporate affiliation, the concepts of sex and gender have lost former social and biological meanings, and differences in these characteristics have become no more significant than differences in the color of eyes, skin, or hair. The concept of strain came into use. Members of the same strain, regardless of their biological sex at birth, can combine their DNA and have common offspring. The DNA of different strains is in most cases incompatible. According to the law on the unification of humanity, all corporations are required to strive for a uniform number of different strains in the population, both within the corporation and at its different sublevels. Union between different strains is highly socially encouraged, since there is still a chance that their DNA can combine. A transplanetary policy of equivalence of strains is being pursued, aimed at reuniting humanity into one species. However, new strains appear every few decades. The physical and mental differences between the 9 main strains are becoming increasingly obvious, and the likelihood that different strains will be able to produce offspring is becoming increasingly less likely. Human civilization is at the stage of formation of new species, some of which show a tendency towards hierarchical primacy. Humanity tries to restrain the division of their species and hierarchical stratification based on strains, since they are unable to predict what the supernova of humanity will turn into. The